All right. Well, I'm pleased to be joined by Steve Nelson, who was recently promoted to Director of Water and Wastewater at WSB, headquartered right here in Golden Valley, Minnesota. In his new role, Steve will lead and grow the firm's water/wastewater team, support business development, and lead the firm's biological filtration and water wastewater innovation efforts. Um, Steve joined WSB last year as a senior project manager and has uh, worked to elevate the firm's water wastewater services throughout Minnesota. And should mention that you also have 30 years of water and wastewater industry experience. So, Steve, thank you for checking in. And how you doing today?
I'm doing wonderfully. Thanks for looking forward to chatting and um, answering your questions. So appreciate this.
Yeah, so thank you. And first off, I guess just how long have you been in this new role with WSB?
It's pretty recent, a couple weeks essentially at this point.
Okay. And I gave a brief introduction there, but can you talk a little bit more about some of your duties in your new role and what you'll be trying to accomplish?
Yeah. So in my role as director of water wastewater at WSB, I'll be helping, leading and growing the firm's water wastewater team by supporting business development. I've always enjoyed, you know, collaborating with the peers in the industry and serving our clients, leading biological filtration efforts, which has been my passion for years, continuing to help communities reduce PFAS contamination, and promoting innovative water wastewater solutions.
Okay. And and I guess just to back up a little bit, can you just give us a little more background on WSB as a firm? I know, of course, they do a lot of water, wastewater work, a lot of work in the transportation side. Can you just give us a brief little summary of WSB?
Absolutely. So WSB is a design and consulting firm specializing in engineering, community planning, environmental services, and construction services. Began regionally and have expanding from there. Our staff, works together with people um, across multiple, you know, help people engage, I guess, on communities, engage with transportation, the infrastructure, energy, and their environment. And
Okay. Hmm.
that opera services, I guess it's 30 complementary areas that are, to help integrate, again, planning, design, implementation. And also it's becoming more key, with the moving towards smart cities, but, monitoring, maintaining how your infrastructure is going so you can plan renovations and replacement. Sometimes it's referred to as asset management.
Okay. And are there any particular projects you're working on that you could mention or any specific initiatives?
Well, we're continuing to help cities with, assess and address and remove PFAS contamination. Just as recently as this Monday, I was at a council workshop, um, and we can talk more about that later. But that's one area. But also a big, as I mentioned, a passion of mine has been this biological filtration. I've done a lot of like kind of roll up your sleeves type work where you climb into filters, and it also had some expertise in corrosion control. And that helped led to the discovery that a lot of these filters historically have been seen having, chemical and physical mechanisms for um, constituent removal like iron and manganese, but there's almost always biology active as well. So that has been happening outstate through my career, maybe starting, as many as 20 years ago, but just recently moving into the metro. And I think we currently have biological pilot studies going in. I don't know if I can mention specific cities, but four and probably six in line for that either have had and are now implementing to are currently piloting. We have a pilot unit up and we have people in line. And these are large, 70,000 population level communities. So that's a real exciting development where communities were given them the option. For a while it was seen that the metro is not ready for this, to use microbes to help treat the water, but WSB kind of forged ahead and stepped up and said, well, let's let the communities decide. We know it's been working great outstate and teaming, where there's industry needed in a city like Missoula, Minnesota, to meet industrial demand, more than double the capacity of the plant. They don't have to add chemicals up front like chlorine and permanganate, which is always concerns about what those interactions will do to cause, maybe byproducts that may not be as healthy as we'd like them to be. So give the communities and give the metro the opportunity to decide if they're willing to kind of harness nature to greatly reduce treatment costs, but also have less potential for byproducts by adding less chemicals, working with nature versus kind of fighting what wants to happen naturally in the filters. So those are some of the key things. I'd say the PFAS, contamination testing, also the biological filtration is really kind of the big, there's a lot of momentum there.
Okay. And just to back up a little bit, when we talk about PFAS, that's basically a human-made chemical that doesn't get along well with the environment. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, PFAS is, the ones regulated right now are like 6 man-made. The easiest term to remember is like forever chemicals.
Mm-hmm.
It's PFAS is the acronym, but it's per and polyfluoroalkyl substances. A lot of them were associated with having coatings that are slick, like Scotch Guard, or coatings on pizza boxes, but all the way to firefighting foams. And the reason they were used for that is they're not destroyed by heat, and they're kind of slick and slippery. But that also makes them very much kind of that forever chemical. When they get through the body, they can't. If they're in a fire, they're still going to exist, and they also allow them to kind of slide around in the environment. So a lot of that started in the metro here with Minnesota Attorney General had basically helped write the expert witness report for the natural resource damages case. That was essentially 13 communities in East Metro about a $900 million settlement. So that was kind of concentrated there, and they're treating those waters down to zero, down to non-detect, because that's how the case was settled, that the natural resource didn't have this in it. We don't accept any in it. So, test down it. If it's detectable, we need to treat more. So they'll have 2 filters in a row. Now it's becoming more and more, we're seeing elsewhere, in the West Metro and the North Metro and the South Metro, pretty much all over. More and more people are testing. Department of Health is starting to test, and they soon will require testing. And it's showing up closer to the new levels that the EPA announced that it was recently, which are very close to basically the detection limits. So that is a concern, like that council meeting in the North Metro is at council workshop meeting on Monday. These cities are starting to try and get ahead of it, and they're testing themselves and realizing, hey, we need to actively plan everything we do in the future for the potential to possibly have to treat PFAS, and maybe to a level where we might have to treat the majority of our water. So, and that can affect prior plans for, space allocated for a treatment plant, to wells that were just recently drilled, to some cities maybe just built a treatment plant. So it's an evolving concern, and our Department of Health is also encouraging people to, and we are, to, with your website and communications, and WSB can help with that as well, of course, just kind of develop a campaign, an educational campaign, so residents are aware and know that maybe some of the plans they had, softening plant, or a different type of plant, or a campus, a public works campus expansion, there needs to be room and allocated for a potential future PFAS treatment. And what are cities doing with the wells where that has been detected, but maybe does not yet exceed currently regulated limits.
Hmm. So the concern is the impact of these chemicals on drinking water, essentially, right?
Yes, it's becoming more so because they are a forever chemical. Some of the treatments that would sometimes be acceptable, like reverse osmosis, would just concentrate the PFAS on the stream that you're sending to the sewer, for example. And kind of the phrase I've come up with that to help explain to people is, the MPCA and others really want to avoid kind of kicking the can down PFAS road. In other words, let's not just give it to the wastewater plant, but let's not just, you know, land applied if it ends up in residuals. Let's try and take care of it. So really the preferred, it's kind of leading towards some of the best available treatment technologies that are adopted and probably have the least liability associated with them. So it's a concern that we just don't want to keep spreading the forever chemicals around. We want to try and capture them in a way where it can be brought to like what's ever captured can be brought to a facility and incinerated and destroyed.
Okay. So when we talk about these forever chemicals, and you touched on this a little bit, but what do you see as what is the impact on I guess design and construction of these plants, and do you see more work coming down the road in this area as we address these issues?
Could you rephrase that or repeat that question? I'm not sure I completely.
Well, and just looking at in terms of as we become more aware and more aggressive in treating these chemicals, does that mean we'll be building more of these plants or designing them in a different way or expanding more? What is the impact on from a design and construction perspective?
Yes. So again, the East Metro communities where they have the settlement, through the Attorney General Natural Resource Damages settlement, those are treated to zero. So most of those, even if they were considering blending alternative sources, it seems like all those are going to treatment with granular activated carbon. And that's, you think of them like maybe if you picture like an asteroid with a bunch of caves in it, if we're really to zoom in on it, it's the ropes that would be the PFAS are kind of end up in those little cave spots. And then that all those mini asteroids, which are the size of a piece of sand, are then sent to a facility and they incinerate it, remove the PFAS, and then replace what was in that canister, essentially. So that is really what the primary mode is in the East Metro, because that's what the settlement was based on. Treatment to restore a natural resource, so there's none of this in it. Now, elsewhere, there is room for things like blending. So if you have a well that exceeds a little next to, and you have other wells that don't, you can bring them together at a treatment plant, blend them, and as long as what goes into the system on a quarterly average doesn't exceed the regulated levels, you're fine. You could also go to things like alternative sources. There's a aquifer that's reserved from the Mount Simon aquifer that the DNR has really put a moratorium on, trying to save for the future. It's very much older water. No promises there, but those are the types of things that also be looked at. That maybe cities could allow, the DNR would allow appropriations of that cleaner water too, or other alternative sources. But it's really up to the cities, to decide how they want to meet. I know a lot of cities might tend towards wanting to treat it all, but it's very expensive on a life cycle cost because you have to replace all that media, paper to be all the way incinerated. On the average, like on the East Metro, is like every 1 to 2 years. So that's an ongoing O&M expense that really adds up faster than you might think it would. It's not just the initial capital to build a plant, but it's continuing to have to pay to get that forever chemical kind of burned out of your media and get new media in it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, what's the outlook for funding for these types of projects? I know that there's through deed, I believe there's some funding available to cities and towns that, I mean, these are pretty big projects, I assume. And if you're a small town, you can't afford to just do that on your own. Um, what do you what is the outlook for funding these projects, and how does that compare with the needs out there?
Um, I'd expect that this is going to continue to evolve, but for example, the $900 million settlement mentioned in the East Metro, there's like 13 communities there. One of the plants that we built the removal for is like 3 million gallons a day. That's like a 7 million. Um, there's another facility, a larger community, probably the largest community there. It's looking like it's more 150 million. So those we're talking some really big numbers. But again, that's for life cycle. Those costs I give you are actually initial costs, but plus you have the life cycle costs. You start to see, which are probably going to be more than twice that, over like 30 years. Um, there is some bills, they call it for like emerging contaminants funding.
Hmm.
So there's potential funding available through a bipartisan infrastructure law for emerging contaminants that has 5 billion for state low interest loans. But 5 billion, if you think over 50 states, is and some of the numbers I just mentioned is not doesn't seem like a lot of money to me. Um, and there's also $4 billion in grants available for disadvantaged communities. So I don't know exactly what that is going to quantify that, but it probably be things like low income, ratio of the cost of the project to the average income. Those types of metrics are typically used. Um,
Hmm.
but I just it would seem like if everyone wants to treat, it seems like there's going to be a demand for more, maybe congressionally directed spending or some other kind of. Right now, yeah, that I see a kind of a disparity there between what the potential need could be and the cost we're talking about, especially for renewable.
Hmm.
That's why communities will have the ability to maybe look at blending or going to this alternative source or other options versus the very expensive life cycle cost of building the plant and then replacing it immediately every 2 years.
Hmm. Yeah, and so I understand you've been in the water and wastewater industry for 30 years. How has that industry evolved since you started out all those years ago? Is it just more focus on certain types of dealing with these human forever chemicals, as you call them, or just more awareness of that being out there? Or what are some of the biggest changes that you've
I,
seen?
I actually started my career in a national firm in Kansas City in 1989. So,
Mm.
and there I was working with a very kind of spearhead group of all PhDs and master's degree, kind of on just the process and helping with the Safe Drinking Water Act was just getting going and a lot of that. So there was a lot of, um, I'd say the more standard constituents of contaminants of concern at that point. Now it's this whole emerging contaminants of concern. And a lot of that's driven by just the technology to be able to measure down to lower and lower and lower levels. The
Mm.
PFAS example, is one of them. Just recently, EPA came out and say they're going to set at 4 parts per trillion. So, I mean, that's like a little tiny beaker of PFAS, like 50 mils, would be in like 30 billion gallons just to be
Mm.
so if you look at like a Brooklyn Park water tower, it
Mm.
would be like 3,000. So it's just very, very minute. And then they're setting the standard at that because the detection limits at 2 parts per trillion. So that
Mm.
makes you ask, where will that go if they can measure lower? And we're currently only regulating 6 of those PFAS constituents, and there's like potentially like 3,000 combinations of PFAS constituents. So that's one of the things is the science of being able to measure things, and then how do you handle the epidemiology, saying what the risk is, and then where is that going to lead us? So I don't think we would have had the technology back in 1989 to measure down to that low level. I think
Mm.
that's a good thing for um, human health. Um, but it's definitely a change I've seen. And other things, some of the
Mm.
things that are along those emerging contaminants are things that are like don't get removed in a wastewater plant, or things that we didn't think about. Some of them are called like endocrine disruptors, so hormones and things that people might be taking, or just also byproducts of humans and animals. But those can, like growth hormones, endocrine disruptors, things like that. Those are some of the other emerging things. So those are
Hmm.
things I wouldn't have dreamt about, back in 1990.
Yeah, interesting. How did you get into this line of work, or what attracted you to, I guess, engineering in general, or specifically to working on water and wastewater projects?
As a kid growing up in uh, Maple Grove, I worked at a private pool for a townhouse association, and I also
Hmm.
taught swim lessons and watched the gate and kind of had three jobs at once. But I really got interested in just water in general, just maintaining the pumps, backwashing the pumps, keeping the pool crystal clear. Well, just really kind of enjoyed that. So that, and then the joy of just being outside. So that led me towards civil engineering, and then eventually to get a master's in environmental health and focusing drinking
Hmm.
water.
I imagine there's a lot of demand out there for people with your type of expertise. Just as it seems like there's a shortage of pretty much every.
Uh, well, Brian, if you're willing to start taking classes, we're looking. We'll
Well,
take your application for sure. So, yeah, no, there's a definite demand out there, and it does seem to be. Well, maybe there's less people that have gotten into engineering, or it might be just there's so, like I said, some of this momentum. Firms are just seeing that there could potentially be a lot of work to address some of these concerns with PFAS contamination. So,
yeah. Well, my kids might take you up on
all right,
going down that career path. So, um,
talking about it at baseball tonight, huh?
yeah, for sure, for sure.
Well,
But hey, Steve, is really nice chatting with you. Did you have anything else you wanted to talk about before I let you go? It's been a fun conversation.
uh, yeah, just you asked. Well, I'm just looking forward to taking this new leadership role on, and I believe in our firm's commitment to what's next in infrastructure and environmentally friendly, sustainable solutions. And that's one of the things that I'm proud to work with WSP, because there's other firms that um, maybe have not picked up the ball. For example, like harnessing biological treatment, and so that's something I'm really excited about.
Well, great. Well, Steve, good luck to you in your new role, and thanks again for your time. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Have a great night. Enjoy the
You
weather.
too. Thank you. Take care.
Okay. Bye.